So I'll start by setting context, and I want to do that by citing our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who called Britain and the United Kingdom the awesome foursome. If I were live, I'd probably hear you chuckling. But is it really an awesome foursome? Or is Britain actually really breaking up? That's what I want to talk about today. And certainly the view from Scotland and Glasgow is it's an emphatic bye-bye, right? Since summer 2020, we've had 18 consecutive polls that have shown majorities for independence. Just 2 days ago, the polling company Savanta Comres found this last week, that 57% say yes and 43 no to independence, and that's once don't knows are removed. So that gives you a sense for the strength of feeling at the moment in Scotland. It is the most sustained period of support for independence that we've had pretty much ever. Okay, and that does suggest that Britain is in trouble. But if Britain is on the verge of breakup, what do socialists say about that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And how do we know? So I'm going to spend the first part of my talk today by trying to answer that latter question. How do we know? And how do socialists relate to the national question in general? And then only after we've done that, will I return to the question of Britain itself to ask what attitude should be taken by socialists towards the awesome foursome. Right. To begin with, to be a socialist or a Marxist is to emphatically be an internationalist. Most of you have probably read the Communist Manifesto, and it ends or gets to, when you get towards the end, speaks of workers of the world unite. Now, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels even made a prediction, which turns out to be a bit wrong, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. He says, national differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. Now, as we know, nations are still around. So in this sense, Marx and Engels were manifestly wrong, right? But they do make an important point, which is that nations are transient, right? They have not always been there, not as we know them now. They're quite a recent phenomenon, born with capitalism, and in a nutshell, Marx and Engels are saying to die with capitalism. So I'm going to spend some time discussing this. What do we mean by what was there before nations, and what was people's identity like? How did they see themselves? And you could probably argue there were different identities, some narrower than the nation, some broader than the nation today. So you could talk about the locality as somewhere where you're from being determinative of who you are. You could speak about your religion, which would unite you with people regardless of what territory they lived in. That's rather than a nation. Now, when you also think about territories under the control of states once upon a time before capitalism, they were not automatically characterized by such things as a common language or a common culture in that territory. Let's just give you the local example of 12th century England. That was made up of what is mostly modern England today, but also parts of Western France and parts of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. Military rulers in 12th century England spoke Norman French. The literate elite of administrators spoke Latin, and the population as a whole spoke different dialects and forms of Anglo-Saxon, French, Welsh, and Gaelic. Hardly the linguistic nation state that we imagine today. When did this change? Probably around the 16th century, with the rise of merchant capitalists who are challenging the old feudal lords for power. What they need is, I'll argue in a minute, a linguistic nation state. Why is that? Well, rising capitalist classes need markets, unified markets, where they can trade seamlessly, where they can communicate amongst each other and others. They also need administratively efficient states, people who can weigh up whether a contract was valid, what was broken. They need infrastructures, meaning roads and ways of transporting themselves. They need police to ensure their property rights, ends to rouse, and so on. And they need a homogeneous labor force. The more they're becoming industrial capitalists, they need people that they can rely on to do the work for them, to build whatever it is that they want to trade in. All of this demands a common national language and culture. So in a nutshell, there's something of an elective affinity between markets and early capitalism and the nation. They, as it were, are born together and grow up together. This is something of a spontaneous process. In early examples like Holland and England, the first capitalist economies. However, it does become conspicuously more top-down as time goes on. So by the time of, let's say, the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, there is a consistent ruling class, or middle class, cadre, that tries to invent the nation, and once it takes power to make sure that people are turned into the nation. Hence some books that, for example, have titles like Turning Peasants into Frenchmen. This is a process that comes very much top down. Which dialect, for example, of a national language becomes the national language is a thing of chance. But the overall trend spreads. It spreads within Europe to places like Germany and Italy, but later on, when you think about the end of the First World War, it's the collapse of the East European and Southeast European empires, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And then in the 20th century, it's an incredibly global process with the struggle for decolonization and the rise of nation states, as Britain and France, for example, withdraw or are ejected from much of what we now call the global South. The point here is, to be successful in the world economy, you wanted evermore to be something like the French when they were setting up their nation state. Their grand bourgeois revolution was a model. To be modern, you had to be a capitalist linguistic nation state. In other words, nationalism is emerged as part and parcel of the superstructure of capitalist development. It is a quintessentially capitalist ideology. As capitalism spreads, it does so unevenly, and that's an important point, because there are different, if you like, different socioeconomic strength, different states, and so on. Inevitably, some groups within the global capitalist world economy were able to found states and develop successfully, and others were prevented from doing so by the stronger, often imperialist states. They're prevented either from setting up linguistic nation states or even having national rights within nation states. So we get either direct colonial conquest or national oppression within given mixed territories. Think about, let's say, blacks or African Americans in the United States. Now, it appeals for equality within states like the US, or in international relations between nations and between states, takes the form often of national struggles. And these national struggles sweep up the poor and the oppressed. Their demands are articulated on the level of nations, because nationalism is such a quintessential capitalist ideology. It's so omnipresent. It is the natural state of affairs. So to be equal, you demand to be a nation just like everyone else. Now, does that mean that socialists should champion every national struggle? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. This is why we're having this discussion today. Nationalism is inherently a class project of a potentially ruling class. This is an important aspect of the story of a potentially ruling capitalist class, which, however, in order to establish a nation state or its own claim, needs to pull in the masses of the people behind it. It needs to create the nation. And every national movement presents itself as being united. It's about group unity, but it is also fundamentally divided by class. This is an incredibly important element in the story. To again quote Marx and Engels, the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle. So while socialists will champion the struggle against national oppression and recognize the rights of nations to self-determination, socialists' own standpoint must be the independence and interests of the working class within such struggles. So, moving on, when do socialists support particular national struggles? Now, the response here is, I would argue, twofold. Where struggles weaken imperialism or oppressor ruling classes, that's one element of the story. And where these struggles strengthen the international unity of the working class. In such cases, socialists support particular national struggles. Or to put it somewhat differently, the most revolutionary nationalism is different from revolutionary socialism because they are ideological expressions of distinct class projects. One is a capitalist one, the other is a socialist one. However, because the former includes workers in some sense, we need to relate to it. So each movement has to be carefully weighed on its own merits and how it links up to the overall political situation. Now, within this, how can, some of you may be asking, nationalist struggles strengthen international working class unity? Is that not somehow a contradiction in itself? And here I'm going to speak about, or I'm going to quote directly from Marx's thoughts on British rule over Ireland, in which I think he expresses extremely well why it is that certain nationalist struggles can in fact strengthen international working class unity. So here goes a quick quotation. Every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself, and I'm sure she regards herself, as a member of the ruling nation and consequently becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitudes towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites, the Negroes, in the former slave states of the United States of America. The Irishman pays him back and with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of English rulers in Ireland. So according to Marx, the struggle for Irish independence, even if it was led by the bourgeoisie, could be used by socialists in Britain to challenge the attitudes of British workers and reopen the struggle for socialism against British capitalists. In other words, against the ruling class in Britain. And this is the basis for true internationalism. To again quote Marx, first comes separation, then comes federation. In other words, in order for English workers to be emancipated, they would have to fight on some level and accept the freedom of Irish workers in order for themselves, in order to be able to fight their own ruling class. So that does naturally lead us back to the question of the awesome foursome. If we've talked about England, Britain, and Ireland, what do socialists say about Britain today? I think on one level, it's a pretty simple answer. Britain is a reactionary capitalist world power. So weakening it is a progressive act, undoubtedly. Breaking up imperialist Britain, even if that breakup is led by the bourgeoisies of its component parts, weakens the world's dominant imperialism, which is Euro-Atlantic imperialism, in which Britain is a major player, particularly through its presence in NATO. So we do not shed a tear for Britain. That's the basic line. But what does that concretely mean for socialists? And this isn't, again, not a very easy response. It's not uniform everywhere. It's not the same in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. The answer has to be that it is different for each constituent part of the UK. For socialists in England, which is, I'm presuming, where most of you are from today, the question has to be simply, or the answer has to be simply, that we defend the right of nations to self-determination, which means the right of Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland for that matter, and Wales, should they wish to secede from the United Kingdom. It should also mean the right of all of these to hold an independence referendum, and then to defend the right of the nation to secede should the independence referendum go against the United Kingdom. The premise, surely, is that such an act would weaken Westminster and its unionist political parties, the Tories and Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and the ruling class as a whole, because it would be an existential crisis, when you think about it, for Boris Johnson or any other prime minister to lose Scotland or Northern Ireland, to lose the oldest capitalist state in the world, Britain. And that would open up possibilities for independent struggle by English workers against the ruling class, which is weakened under those circumstances. This would also be a way of saying to Scottish, Irish, or Welsh workers, we're not against you, we're against our rulers. And in that way, you extend a hand of friendship rather than animosity to those who you want to live with perhaps one day in the future. To put it in Boris Johnson's terms, people may be happy to stay in an awesome foursome if they know they can just walk away, rather than stay in an abusive relationship with Boris, right? Now, what about Scotland, which is where I'm from today, and I guess where I want to lead the rest of the discussion? So here it is a little bit more complicated than that. Does support for independence necessarily mean that we support Nicola Sturgeon or the Scottish National Party? In Northern Ireland, would it mean supporting Sinn Féin? Would it mean support Plaid in Wales? These are the big questions, I guess, but I'm going to focus on Scotland, and if anyone wishes, they can then contribute by speaking about Northern Ireland or Wales. And obviously about Scotland, right? So focusing on Scotland, I just want to underline that Britain is in fact a partnership, and has always been, of the English and Scottish capitalist classes from the Act of Union in 1707. In that sense, Scotland was never an oppressed nation. Scottish capitalists benefited just as much as English capitalists did from their joint venture in the empire. Just to speak of Glasgow and the Clyde, it was for a time the biggest shipbuilder in the world. And British capitalists did very well off this. There were also textiles and slaves, and one could go on. So in that sense, Britain Incorporated worked very well for the Scottish bourgeoisie. So Scottish nationalism, insofar as it ever really existed before around about the First World War, would only have been the nationalism of the detachments of the British Army in its imperial glory terms, kilts and such like. But Scottish nationalism undergoes something of a transformation in the 20th century in response effectively to British imperial decline after the First World War. Within that, the Labour Party arises, among other things, in Scotland, and it frequently did in the 20th century express majority discontent with decline and with capitalism. However, it did so in a particularly specific way. It did so without ever decisively challenging the British establishment. Change was only good insofar as it was something that would be allowed by the British establishment, and thus the British Labour Party always remained a unionist party, and that often did not speak to the frustration of various workers and others in Scotland, as Scotland underwent decline, and at times much more grave decline than, let's say, Southeast England. Scottish nationalism, in some ways, began to fill that void at different times and in different places in Scotland in the 20th century. I'm not really going to go into the history of this in any great detail, but it is a telling thing that Labour ultimately stood on the promise of a Scottish Parliament and delivered one in 1999. It did so only, presumably, because it began to understand that Scottish nationalism was a force and it had to somehow relate to it. So it did so by creating a parliament, expected in this way to be the main expression of discontent. However, it also tried to come up with an electoral system that would prevent any one party in Scotland utterly dominating. And this was for fear that the SNP would replace Labour as the dominant party in Scotland. And yet the SNP went on to do just that, just 8 years later in 2007, when it, with the Greens, formed the first coalition government that ousted Labour in the Scottish Parliament. It did so for a variety of reasons. The SNP was able to move left at a time when Labour became New Labour under Blair and moved right because of the Iraq War, because of neoliberalism, PFI, you name it, Blair did it. There was Trident, there was all sorts. There was also the reality of the corruption and complacency of local Labour Party administrations, like in Glasgow City Council, which was very right-wing, which was very top-down, and ultimately felt like it was running a one-party council in a one-party city. That kind of thing was ultimately going to lead to disaster. The SNP tacked left and was able to pick up ruling class votes. In a sense, it was able to articulate that which New Labour had failed to do. And when New Labour fell from power and the Tories returned with austerity, Scotland often bore the brunt of it. Within this context, David Cameron came along with one of his referenda, expecting, just like he did in 2016, that he would resoundingly win. In the end, he did win the Scottish independence referendum, but it wasn't a resounding victory. If anything, he had shown himself to be overconfident. He was saved only by Labour's decision to stand for the union with the Tories, better together, with Gordon Brown playing a particularly important role. Now, this new dividing line in Scotland was between progressive independence and reactionary unionism. There was hardly any space for Labour within this, and Labour began to melt away. And differences between Scotland and Britain have become ever clearer on a whole series of issues. The Brexit vote, whatever one's opinion of it, Scotland voted in favour of remaining and England did not. We also see that Corbynism never quite took off to the same extent in Scotland as it did in England. And just in the last week, the left-wing leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, Leonard, was forced effectively to unceremoniously resign after allegedly, according to a Times article, several big-time donors to the Labour Party demanding his ouster. So Starmer continues effectively to block the Scottish left as well. But it's also a story here of Labour being very unionist and so on. And then we also have Westminster's disastrous handling of COVID-19 in 2020, which Scotland is deemed to have done differently under the SNP. And this explains in many ways the absolute shift in favour of independence since last summer. I just want to, I'll be having to finish very soon, so I'm just going to talk about a little bit about Scotland today. And we are on the cusp of a major election, May 2021, to Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, which the SNP is running on a ticket of change for. And it's not just change here in Scotland, obviously, because it's a ruling party, but a new referendum to leave Britain. Now, both Johnson and Starmer are refusing to countenance such a referendum. And what do socialists in this instance do? Well, certainly what we can see is that centrist SNP, the centrist SNP does not really have the courage to challenge Westminster. Seemingly only consistent campaigning for independence conducted outside the SNP by groups like All Under One Banner has upheld a sense of enthusiasm for independence, not the SNP's campaigning, which is almost non-existent. Furthermore, the SNP's vision of an independent Scotland fails to enthuse. Its Growth Commission of 2018 indicated a blueprint for a neoliberal independent Scotland, hardly something that socialists would support or that the working class would be particularly enthusiastic about. So we on the left here in Scotland have a twofold challenge. On the one hand, to maintain an enthusiasm for independence as a way of overthrowing Westminster rule and opening up the possibility of a different kind of Scotland, something that the Radical Independence campaign was so successful in doing in 2014. But it is also about painting a vision of a far more left-wing Scotland. And how this can be done, well, it's the million-dollar question, but it is in many ways to intervene in demonstrations by things like the All Under One Banner to call for a different kind of Scotland, to enthuse workers to come along to such demonstrations. It is to fight for a Scottish National Convention, like the Catalan one, independent of SNP dominance, that can suggest that there are other forces in Scotland that can independently fight Westminster rather than wait for the SNP. It is also about building alliances with unionist workers around, let's say, the COP26 event later this year, or the People's Assembly Zero COVID campaign. This is part of that way of trying to link up with the English left, because for the Scottish left to simply speak about Scotland is wrong without an English left that is defending the right to self-determination and fighting against both Johnson and Starmer. There is no ally that can weaken Boris Johnson's denial to Scotland of a second referendum. Right, so I'm just going to recap now, because I've almost been speaking for half an hour and I don't want to carry on forever. I'll recap by saying and reiterating socialists and Marxists take an internationalist view. This is fundamental to our worldview. If capitalism is a global system, the working class is a global response to it. It is the international gravedigger of capitalism. We firmly believe, however, that nations came with capitalism and will leave after capitalism goes. In this sense, we're internationalists who need to, in some way, relate to the national question. Nationalism is a contradictory phenomenon, I've tried to argue. It is riven by class divisions, and it is a complex part of the web of global capitalism. Where national struggles weaken imperialism and strengthen working class unity, socialists should support these struggles. But we have to retain an independent class standpoint within them. In the United Kingdom, this means supporting the right to self-determination for the constituent nations. In Scotland, it means refusing to tail the SNP. It means building pressure for socially just independence from below, and it means building solidarity with unionist workers in Scotland and English and Welsh and Irish workers more generally.